Ani Bojo. My name is Bailey Walkie. I'm the founder of Frayed Feathers and the host of the Frayed Feathers podcast. I support teams to create youth reconciliation responses, and I have this podcast to inform youth responses across Canada. So today we are talking about a very spicy topic of whether it is an advocacy problem or an education problem. And I feel like this is a very important distinction because I feel that many people across the reconciliation space have the same values as each other, but there tends to be some friction between people. A lot of people pointing the finger, being very upset, and honestly, understandably so. This is a very emotional thing. Reconciliation initiatives are typically led by people who have been touched or touched, people who have been like forced to be an advocate in some way, like reluctantly. Maybe their community was, um, I don't know, was the victim of a economic or resource extraction of some sorts, and it had damaging effects on their community, and so they got into water reconciliation because of that. Myself being a young Indigenous person, I witnessed a lot of my friends, my family, being mistreated, and I wanted to naturally support that community of people. And so that's why I got into social service work. And so, you know, that's why people get into advocacy, okay? But not everything is that clear cut, right? Like it's not as so like somebody mistreated your friend and now you need to advocate to them. Sometimes things are significantly more complicated than that. And that's why I think it's really important to understand the difference between an advocacy problem and an educational problem, because um, both of them are situations that a good advocate is going to have to deal with. And so you need to be able to go between the two. Okay. So let me illustrate what I mean. You know, Despite people having the same values as you, this is coming from an advocate perspective, you know, some people just have a limited understanding of reconciliation policy, trauma informed approaches, and what it really means to like be an ally. And in many cases, in my opinion, it's an educational problem, as in the person you're working with needs your support to bring them to a level of understanding so that they can be more helpful. And conversely, advocating to somebody is about making a recommendation of a particular policy or cause. And so I witness advocates being unnecessarily rude to people across the table. And I'm here to tell you that as a senior policy analyst and having years in policy experience working directly with ministries, that you're working counterproductive to your goal of being an advocate, in my opinion. And so I recognize that the actions and behaviors that lead us to advocating is very emotional and it's frustrating, and it definitely makes us want to direct our anger at something or someone. And the thing is that they don't tell you when you're beginning is how small the advocacy space really is. And if you're going to be mean to people, then you're going to build a reputation of being that mean person. And many people are not going to want to engage with you. And so, even worse, they might meet with you for the sole purpose of getting you off their back. And that's not good. That's actually tokenizing. That's actually like the exact opposite thing that you want as an advocate. And so, I witness it all the time. It comes from organizations, grassroots groups, and volunteers, and they're not clear on how to move their advocacy forward in a constructive way. And this is really important, because I'm going to tell you a story about how I got into policy, and really it was because I was a social service worker working frontline, directly supporting vulnerable people, and I realized that I needed to do a different job to address the challenges that I was experiencing trying to serve these people. So let's get into that. So I was one of these people not very long ago, like it was just mad, like I was advocating on a regular basis for vulnerable people. And it was really hard for me to accept that some people just didn't understand what I understood and therefore were not able to walk with me in the things that I was saying. you know? And so I acknowledge that that's kind of unsatisfying. You know what I mean? Like if you're an advocate and you see these vulnerable people, like I said, it's very emotionally charged. And so you get in front of this person who's supposed to be on your team and they don't know the first thing about trauma informed approaches or reconciliation or how to do youth engagement in a non tokenizing way. And yeah, and so anyway, like let me just share that story for y'all. And so in starting this social service worker job, I was a youth restorative justice worker. I worked at Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto for a program called Community Council. And so my job was to support people come to our program and receive an alternative sentencing to what a judge would give. So instead of you going to a court system, you as in the person who got caught up in the law somehow, instead of going to a court and a judge giving you whatever they're going to give you, you would then be diverted into my program and you would meet with a community council. Community councils like 2 to 3, sometimes 4 community members who are volunteers who are here to just hear your story, understand what went on. You know what I mean? Like we don't really focus on like, you know, you're guilty and like you need to do things to correct yourself. You know, it's more like, hey, what happened that night? Like, give me your side of the story. Like, why did this happen? Like, what caused you to be in this state that enabled this situation to unfold? And, you know, it's really just about coming to a level of understanding, right? Most of these people, like, you know, oh, I was with my friends, I was drinking, we were caught up, you know, what one person will do is significantly worse than what 5 people will do together. You know what I mean? Like just mob mentality stuff, just people being silly. And, you know, and so anyway, my job is to support that person to fulfill whatever sort of sentencing the community council gives. So the community council might do something like, hey, you know, we want you to continue looking for housing. We want you to look into getting some addictions counseling and, you know, maybe draw a picture, you know, because the person said they like drawing. And if it's in the sentencing or the decision, then we as a caseworker can buy art supplies for them. You know what I mean? So like the idea is just like let's be constructive. You know, this is restorative justice. Like let's not force you to do community service and like repent about your sins. Like let's just try to do something constructive. And most of the time, these people are really trying. You know, they're really trying already, and it just so happens that they got caught up with the law. You know, but like they haven't stopped trying. And so anyway, I just want to like really kind of unpack like how insightful that can be. You know what I mean? Because, you know, I think what happens is that many people get into serving vulnerable people without actually having much engagement with vulnerable people. You know, like many of the people who work in ministries, if they're not implementing a program, you know, they're not working directly with vulnerable people, they probably have extremely little or limited experience working with vulnerable people. And, you know, like, and so anyway, I'll get to that in a second. So my point is just to kind of wrap this point up about social service work and stuff is that, you know, when I was trying to support these people to finish their decisions, you know, sometimes that person got turned away from a government service that for some sort of undeserving reason, you know, and you know, maybe it's not like they got turned away and something big happened, but maybe they're really struggling to communicate in a way that the government worker needs. And, you know, it's helpful for me as the caseworker to attend those meetings and just like kind of be, you know, the translator between the two. So I did this for years. Okay. I think I worked that job for about 3.5 years. And I mean, I was working in shelters before that, you know, just working vulnerable people in general. And you know, I became very sensitive to these moments, you know, like I'd witnessed them so many times, resolved so many disputes. And honestly, most of the time, the reasons why people had these disputes weren't all that satisfying. You know what I mean? You know, it was an education problem, you know, sometimes the person has no idea how to talk to somebody who's vulnerable in a way that doesn't trigger them. You know, they just don't know. They don't have the vocabulary to ask questions in a way that's not intrusive. You know, they don't know how to manage their mannerisms, their behaviors, you know, AKA like maybe they eye roll, maybe they raise their eyebrow, maybe they pucker their lips, maybe they look at you all funny whenever you give an answer. And like all these things while I admit they shouldn't be doing them, sometimes people don't even realize they're doing them. Okay. And I get it. That's unsatisfying. And they should be doing a better job. If you're going to work with vulnerable people, take it upon yourself to be better at that job. But the point is, it's an education problem, because whenever you correct those behaviors, those people make differences and they actually change. You know what I mean? And that's the true reflection of that individual. But it takes unpacking to get to that point. It takes my person advocating to me that somebody mistreated them and then me attending a meeting with them for them to understand they were actually the one in the wrong. And, it's great whenever we can do that. And, there's been cases where we've done that or I've done that for someone and then, they work better with that person longer term. And, that person commits to learning and they come out to our community events and stuff. I'm not saying that's the standard, but it does happen. Okay. And, you know, in these moments, you know, it's very tempting to be rude, like I, as a caseworker, am connected to the person being mistreated. And so naturally, I want to do a good job by serving them correctly. And I don't want any bad things to happen to this person. So it's like, I am justifiably angry in those moments, like I don't want to see this person. I got into this job to avoid these situations, right? Now, connecting this back to young advocates, I feel like many young advocates get into advocacy for the exact same reasons that I got into social service work. Maybe they're not social service workers, but the values are similar. And in the way that I wanted to serve vulnerable people, they also want to do that, especially for Indigenous youth. Indigenous people are overrepresented in near every system of care or social support. And instead of directly working with vulnerable people, these young advocates might sign petitions, attend rallies or community events. And they may also not do any of these things and instead just kind of focus on sharing their political views online. And so these are all examples of advocacy, even though the format is different. And, I really want to point out that we all have the same values and that we don't want vulnerable people to be further mistreated when receiving supports. Okay. Now, fast forward to our current date. I'm now a senior policy analyst, and I work to support social service workers advocate to the government directly through research, submission, and attending working groups. So the organization I work for is the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. Like in my day job, that is not Frayed Feathers, just FYI. And I got into policy because I realized that the problems I was experiencing as a social service worker were actually not something that I could overcome in that position because they're policy problems, you see? Because whenever we have gaps in the system, as we like to say, or problems in the community, it's because the policy, the thing that happened in the higher level, is not inclusive. It did not consider young Indigenous people and how it might affect them differently than it does the general populace, right? And so I needed to elevate my skill set and bring my advocacy to a higher level of discussion so that by the time Indigenous youth responses are rolled out in the community, I've gotten ahead of the problem. Ideally, right? That's the idea that I had whenever I became a policy analyst. And so now instead of advocating directly to other caseworkers about one person, I'm advocating for Indigenous nonprofit housing providers across British Columbia to a faceless ministry that has public commitments to reconciliation. And I know, as a social service worker, that these responses do not play out in community very well. But I need to demonstrate this through research and submissions rather than resolving a personal dispute between a service user and a service provider. If your research is good, then the ministry is likely to engage you in a meeting, to discuss your submission further, right? And so, this is where all these soft skills come in, okay? Meeting directly with government. Because, you don't need to be a policy analyst to meet with government. Anybody in the public can write to their minister. And I'm pretty sure the minister is actually forced, via law to respond to you. It might be a standard letter, might not be a very satisfying response, but they will respond to you like that, like they have to. And so this is why people always say like message your premier or write an email to whatever, you know what I mean? Like they have to read them. And so The dynamic completely changes when you're working with a government worker in this scenario. As a social service worker, most of the time, I needed to engage with government workers to resolve a dispute on account for someone else. And so, in other words, there was a clear like wrongdoing, and we had to come to some sort of resolution. It's a very personal issue. And it's easy in these situations to see the other person as some sort of perpetrator that you need to protect the people you serve from. But as a policy analyst, I don't see, like now in this role, I don't see the person across from me as a perpetrator that needs to answer for all the wrongdoings that a ministry has done or its programs. I recognize that it's just one person doing their job, and many of them don't have a similar experience like I did as a social service worker. They've not had to support vulnerable people experiencing homelessness to do their errands and witness on a daily basis how much more challenging their lives can be. And more importantly, they've not engaged with vulnerable people enough to, on a personal level, to understand that they have everything that you and I have going on, right? Like they have families, friendships, romance, bills, personal drama, and not enough time in the day to address it all. Plus, they need to find where they're going to sleep, where they're going to eat, all these different things. And people are just people, yo. And, folks who have not worked with vulnerable people or grew up with struggle in some sort of way are always going to have a barrier between them and truly connecting with the community. And, as an advocate, you need to recognize this, and you need to not see people working in government projects as some sort of vessel of oppression that you need to advocate to the effect of correcting them or something like that. Like it's not that big. You know what I mean? Like you were not you were not the vessel for altruism by being, or like a beacon for altruism by like being mean to a person who is working in a system that you disagree with. And so how to adjust, like how do you move from being an ad like working from advocacy only to advocacy and educational? Number one, my mantra for myself is come from a place of curiosity. Don't assume the worst. I think that that's like the number one thing I see people who are being mean to people for no reason is like they just assume the worst. Like they assume the government is doing everything counterproductive to social supports. They hate people. They don't want to do like anything at all, and they're never going to get anywhere, and like they don't even know why they're trying because all this and that. It's like, would you want to work with somebody like that? Like, I don't know, man. I know I wouldn't. And so instead of pointing to a gap in the system or program and then pointing the finger at the person across the table, try your best to understand why a program or ministry is structured in a certain way. And you may find that the gap in the system you're engaging the ministry on is actually something much bigger and has nothing to do with that ministry. You know what I mean? And so, in many cases, the person you're engaging with in government does not have bearing on major decisions. So, getting upset with them is unhelpful and only hurts your chance to have continued conversations. And everything worth doing in this world, kind of side note, is going to take time. So, I don't think it's advisable to burn your relationships trying to force a result. And so, second point to this about how to adjust from advocacy only to advocacy and education is that you, as the advocate, need to educate yourself on how ministries actually work and then craft your advocacy letter and talking points, whatever item it is that you're creating. Because I feel like I've witnessed a lot of disappointed advocates. And what happens is they craft a well written letter for the ministry of whatever it might be, and they secure a meeting a month from now, not because the ministry or the minister thinks that like you're not worthy or anything. It's just like that's just how it is. You know what I mean? Like even working in my organization, you can't get a leader's meeting time within like a week or two sometimes. You know what I mean? Like if you're like, I want a one-on-one meeting with this director, I'm gonna have to book two weeks in advance or a week and a half in advance, So imagine what it's like for a minister of a whole ministry. You know what I mean? Like sometimes it really just is like actually like you need to wait a month minimum. That's just how it is. And so Like, people will arrive to the meeting after they've made this well-written letter, and it just doesn't seem like they get anywhere. Like the minister just doesn't really have concrete answers to the content that was written in your letter. And I feel that the disappointment mostly stems from advocates expecting the minister to have talking points, like to answer their call. You know what I mean? So like, you have a coalition of organizations, they all recognize that there is a specific process in a ministry that needs development, as in, excuse me, as in it's not doing a very good job of whatever it's supposed to do. And so you make this letter, you have all these people who are supporting your messaging, and then the minister just has nothing to say about what you're actually talking about. You know what I mean? Like, I understand why that's disappointing. That makes total sense why that's disappointing. But in my opinion, as a senior policy analyst, what I've witnessed over many meetings with ministry and ministers is that it just doesn't work like that. Like, you don't submit a letter to a minister about whatever it might be and expect them to be able to answer your call and like have concrete talking points to the things that you wrote about, because practically speaking, the minister probably did not read your letter. You know what I mean? And that's not to say it didn't get read, but they had their team read it, and then their team wrote a briefing to inform the minister about what to say in the meeting with you. Okay. Like, we have to recognize that a minister's job is to direct people. They are recognized as a leader to the effect that they don't need to do research, reporting, and writing. They tell other people to do it, and then they stay focused on making informed decisions about how they can direct people better. You know what I mean? That's what a minister does, right? Like, they have teams built around them. So, like, we also need to acknowledge that ministers are given a job, right? They're not given the role of a minister and then they just get to work on what they want to work on. It's not like they're given a branch of the government and they're like, here's your personal business. You know what I mean? Like, go do stuff that you want to do that you think's important. No, actually, they have mandates like written to them by their premier or their party leader. And these mandates are very clearly outlining what they need to do over the next political cycle, usually about 4 years. I think some provinces go up to 5. And then, of course, election shenanigans, sometimes here nor there, whatever. And so, like, what we need to acknowledge is that our letters that we spent months writing on in support with all these other people and had so many people proofread and wordsmith and all this stuff, it may not actually align with the mandate letter that is given to them by their boss, their party leader. Okay? So, practically speaking, what you are asking them to do by writing this letter to them is add more plate to their work from a person who is not their boss. Now, it's not to say that your advocacy is not worth doing. It's probably well worth doing. You know what I mean? And I probably agree, that it's probably something that we should do. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of things like we ought to do, right? But I mean, if somebody who doesn't work at Frayed Feathers came up to me and was like, "Frayed Feathers, you need to do this," I'd be like, "But you don't even know what I've been mandated to do, like what I actually do." You know what I mean? So you're not positioning yourself, you as in like advocates, advocates are not positioning themselves to have a minister have concrete talking points and be able to connect their work to yours. And, like, they're only going to do what they're mandated to do. And so it's really important that we look at these mandate letters and all these other ministry functions as a way to align our advocacy with what ministers and government is expected to do. Because otherwise they're just not going to do it. You know what I mean? Like, so much of advocacy, you're overcoming so many barriers just to get momentum on it, right? Like in ministry, most of the time, government doesn't want to do anything that isn't going to give them a partisan advantage. You know what I mean? And while I acknowledge that reconciliation is not about partisan advantages, I could certainly point to some public commitments in reconciliation to say, look, if you want to really demonstrate your commitment to reconciliation and do something that is not tokenizing and will be well received by the community, you should fund our project because we will do this, that, all these things that you are mandated to do in respects to reconciliation. And if it goes well, maybe I've secured some money from our organization and the partners I'm working with. Okay. Conversely, many advocates just say, hey, you're effing up and we want money so you can address or so we can address this gap. But if they're not told by their boss to address that gap right now, they're not going to listen to you. Like that's just how it is. You know what I mean? And like it's not that they don't value what you're saying, but it's also a job, okay? And this is why I wanted to make the I wanted to share the story about being a social service worker and like really demonstrating like the that like I acknowledge that a lot of advocates are in similar positions, right? Like they see vulnerable people all the time. Maybe they work with them, you know, maybe like in passing or even like kind of like adjacent. And you know, we want better for them, and we want all this stuff to change, and we want reconciliation and the system to be better, and all this and that. But if we don't look at the system as a system, like we always say it is, then how can you expect to make a difference? You know what I mean? Like you think about hacking, right? Like hacking, like person on a computer, you know, like a hacker, you know, on its very fundamental levels, it's about taking software and making it do something that you want it to do, you know? So you're hacking the system by changing some code and saying, you're supposed to behave like this, but I'm going to change some letters and words, and now you're going to behave like this in a way that works to my benefit, okay? That's hacking the system. So if we consider that metaphor in the context of government and the government system, well, we need to understand the system as a whole. We need to learn how to code and understand the language and understand the mandates that are going into this system so that we can adjust and hack that system in a way that is beneficial to reconciliation initiatives. Okay. So, you know, like, I think it's not enough to be angry. You know, this isn't the movies. You can't just go up on a podium, say a bunch of really inspiring things, and expect a movement of people to come behind you. You know, that's just not how it works. Okay. And I acknowledge that grassroots initiatives get praised for stepping up to the big bad government and winning, but in all those stories, there is typically a very low point and honestly, like a good amount of luck that comes in, you know? And so me, I'm not into that. Like I don't want to like be a shot in the dark, maybe hit a good luck. I want to be consistent. I want to be doing good work consistently. I don't want to feel like garbage until the moment of a final big payoff. You know what I mean? Like working in reconciliation initiatives, working as a social service worker, as a policy analyst, we see me and the people in this sector. I mean, we see some of the we work with some of the most morbid ideas in society. Like we literally witness like how system is meant to fail certain demographics, you know. And it's infuriating. That's why I committed my career to this, you know. I mean, I could be making way more money doing other stuff, you know, but it doesn't get me out of bed in the morning. You know what I mean? I could be a social media marketer, make twice the amount of money, but like it's just empty to me. You know what I mean? Like I want to see good things happen up for my community. I want to like be on my deathbed and be satisfied that like I actually did some good work in this world, you know? And what I realized is that just by being passionate and angry and wanting to make a difference, it's not enough. You know, it's not enough to like make the difference that I want to see in the world, you know, and it comes down to me being okay with coming from a place of empathy. You know what I mean? Like just leveling with people and like walking as slow walking as fast as the slowest person in the project. You know what I mean? And a lot of the times in government situations, when these people don't have the education of working with vulnerable people, it's typically government workers, you know? But that being said, it's not always, you know? And so this is why it's important to understand advocacy and education because You may find that in your advocacy teams, there's people who need education. And if you go around advocating with the same veracity, or is that even velocity? Am I like mixing up words right now? Anyway, if you start being mean to people on your team just because you think that they're doing something wrong and you're like the advocate and whatever, that's not going to be very helpful. Maybe the person actually just needs to be educated on how to better address this certain situation. And so, anyway, in the beginning of advocacy initiatives working in government, it's always a slog to get any momentum. When I started working in policy a little under 4 years ago, at first, the Ministry of Children and Family Development in British Columbia didn't know much about the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, like the organization I work for in my day job. But fast forward to now, and MCFD, Ministry of Children and Family Development, reaches out to us for submissions and comment about their initiatives because we've demonstrated to be a good partner. And, I've led this relationship near from start to finish. And I assure you, like, I've never licked boots. I don't bend on our organizational values. And sometimes we disagree in big ways, but we still maintain a strong working relationship because of all the things that I've outlined here today. Like I see MCFD staff at conferences and we hug because not all of them there, because we recognize that even though we are on the other side of the table, our values are the same. We both want reconciliation, and just because a system that has been in place for centuries does not bend to our values doesn't mean that we can't work together. Okay. And so, in conclusion, in the same way I got into social service work and young Indigenous advocates get into reconciliation initiatives, ministry workers tend to get into government because they want to help people. I'm not saying that's always the case, but that is a lot of the case in my experience. And if you reject this idea, like you hate the system, you think the government is evil, and you see engaging with them as like you being defeated in some way, in my opinion, you're not an advocate and you just have an opinion. You know what I mean? Like an advocacy is somebody who has actually let me search this up. Advocacy meaning public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. Okay, so I mean, if your cause is like F the government, we want anarchy, well, I wouldn't say you're really an advocate. I would say you just have an opinion on something. And anyway, like an advocate is someone who provides insightful recommendation and solutions to issues in policy. Okay, and like you actually need to understand the system to do that. If you just reject the system and you think everything is black and white, it's evil, we're good, well, like you're not really going to provide an opinion, or provide a recommendation. You know what I mean? You're more just essentially saying like, do this. You know what I mean? And that's not a recommendation, in my opinion, or perhaps it is by definition, but it's not one they're going to move forward on. And if you're not providing recommendations that people could actually move forward on meaningfully, then you're not advocating for anything, in my opinion. Like you're just saying an opinion. I've hit this nail. I've made this point. Okay. Anyway, so the best advocates, in my opinion, are the ones who empathize with the other side and try to move forward in the best way. If that's not your style, that's okay. But I just wanted to share that as a senior policy analyst, I've never seen hateful words or emotions come into a meeting and enforce ministry to make the right decision. We don't see hate speech come in here from the advocacy, the right side, and them like see the glimmer in our eyes and change everything. That's not how it works. And what I have seen, conversely, is being relational, making a genuine effort to understand the other person, and that is what leads to great projects coming into fruition. So, check out my website, frayedfeathers.ca, sign up to my newsletter, link is in the description, connect with me on LinkedIn, that is also in the description, and I will catch you next week.